Hello, welcome everyone to our Chapter 1 chat this evening. My name is Kate Mayer and I'm the National Category Manager of Fiction here at Dymocks, and I'm here to talk to Markus Zusak. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. How good is this?
It's amazing.
I leave home.
Yeah, exactly. Keeping us connected when we're all sort of stuck at home. But the book thief is what we're talking about this evening, because we recently had our book lover poll, our Dymocks Top 101, which is a book lover voted poll, and book thief, after 15 years of publication, has taken out our top spot, a joint top spot for the first time ever with Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. And we're absolutely thrilled to be speaking about the book because Markus has obviously had Bridge of Clay out in 2018, which is a great Australian novel. But we're back to the basics, and I'm so excited to be speaking to Markus about the book thief this evening. So welcome, Markus.
Thank you. And thanks to all Dymocks readers who voted for the book thief again. And it's funny, I've gone through all these years and different stages of being embarrassed about the book doing so well and not feeling like I deserved it. Not that I feel more deserving now, but I've sort of learned to just sort of go, God, enough time elapses that you can really look back fondly on a book. And and I look back with a lot of affection on the book thief and what it was like writing that book and all the limited expectations I had, because I thought it was going to be my least successful book. And look, we're here 15 later talking about it. So I'm so grateful to the book. It was sort of the book that kind of made me, and not the other way around. And so I'm just really grateful to it, and to all the readers out there who've taken it, to their hearts the way they have.
Yeah, and I guess you've probably been doing a bit of touring, obviously, before lockdown for Bridge of Clay. So it might be a bit of a treat for us to be able to hear you talk more about the book thief this evening. It's probably even a bit interesting for you to have that experience.
It's really funny because when you put a new book out, sometimes people want to interview you and they say, well, I'm not going to talk about the book thief at all, as if it's some taboo subject. And I sort of go, I'm happy to talk about the book thief. And often it's me bringing the book thief back into the conversation, because in a way you can't talk about Bridge of Clay without talking about the book thief, because it's that book that made Bridge of Clay such a difficult book to write, because of those sort of expectations that you think readers may have, or that people who don't like you may have, or what critics might have. And so it was this sort of beautiful storm cloud that hung over everything. So now, and I'd never wish it away. I'd never, and I always said, even at the time when it came out and suddenly it started doing really well, that I used to say, if all of this stopped tomorrow, if a ray of light came out of the sky and said, you're never going to get another book published, you're never going to have any sort of success at all, or have another book, I'd say I couldn't do the On the Waterfront speech of, I never got my shot at the title. I never, I could have been a contender. The book was my big shot, and it could have sunk without a trace, and it didn't. So I'm thrilled to be talking about it tonight.
Yeah, and it's so good to see so many people tuning in. I'm interested to hear where everyone else is tuning in from this evening. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned with the book thief such a long time ago, and the Bridge of Clay. But with Bridge of Clay, we had it as our book of the month. So at Dymocks, we have a book of the month every month. And in 2018, it was the biggest selling book of the month we had this year. That year was Bridge of Clay. So It's absolutely a success in its own right. But in terms of sort of book thief, we're talking about 16 million copies here. So I'm assuming that most people that are tuned in have actually read the book, but there might be some that haven't. So I'm going to throw you in the deep end just a little bit here, Markus, and say, for anyone who is tuning in who might not have read it, can you tell us a little bit about the plot?
It's all going so well until now. It's funny, and I did see one of the comments on the side saying, The Messenger is by far your best work. and everyone has a right to their opinion, and in that way, that book was a stepping stone to the book thief. See how I'm putting off your question now? But I guess I'll go back to the very start. One of the few little facts that I've just remembered recently is that the book thief came from my childhood playing, football and cricket and, even playing hockey and things with cricket bats in the backyard, and coming in from the steaming heat of Sydney to hear my parents talk about growing up in Europe, outside of Munich and outside of Vienna during World War II. And it was like a piece of Europe came into our house. And it was funny, and this is the piece that I had totally forgotten to tell people, was that originally I was going to write a kind of biography of my mum's life growing up in Germany during World War II and after it. And one of the little things that she told me was that when the American soldiers were in Munich, they had their own radio station, and and they brought their own food. And hi to all those people from all around the world, by the way. I'm just
Czech Republic.
Thank you. It's so great. And Alabama now. It's great. Thank you. But I remember my mum telling me how they had their radio station, the Americans, and they couldn't say Munich, which in German is München or München, and they called it Munchen, which is so funny. And they called their radio show at midday, it was called Luncheon in Munchen, and I thought that was my original first title for the book, was Luncheon in Munchen. And it doesn't have quite the same ring as The Book Thief, it doesn't have quite the same appeal. So I was going to write this quite, I just thought it was going to be a factual book. And then I realised, having written 3 young adult books, and I realised that I couldn't write biographies because I'm always thinking, what if this happened, or what if that happened? And so instead of it being that, I went to this idea it's going to be a novella. It's going to be maybe a 120-page book. And then I had this idea of a girl stealing books in modern-day Sydney, and I thought, maybe just put that into that idea that's set in Nazi Germany. And then I had the idea, hello to Nepal as well. That's amazing. And and then I had this idea of having Death narrate the novel. And so it was always going to be about a girl who is stealing books in Nazi Germany, and she's reading them to this young Jewish man who was firstly an older Jewish man who was staying in her basement. And then you go through all of these stages. So rather than really talking about the plot, I'm talking to you now about all the things that were in it and then got cut out. But originally Max was a much older man, and he was a professor, and he just sort of happened to come into this town of Malking where Lisa lived. And it was a bit too coincidental. And so I actually cut him out of the book completely. You can't have The Book Thief without Max, and you can't have The Book Thief without Death. I also cut Death out of the book completely at one stage too. The only thing that never really got cut out was Liesl. And but so many things change all the time, and you're always trying to find what works. And so I did finally arrive at this idea, and it was a big breakthrough, was that Max was going to be the son of a man who spared his life, who saved Hans Huberman's life in the First World War. And suddenly all the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Now, I've just noticed someone on the screen has asked, how did you come up with narrating? So many things in novels are just pure chance from sitting down and doing the work. And I was working with some kids at a school, and I got them to write about colours in the sky, or just colours in general. And I wrote with them, and I realised I'd written 3 really short stories about people dying. I was working in a high school, and that must have been how I was feeling that day. And but I realised I'd written from Death's point of view, and I thought, what if I just put that in that book set in Nazi Germany? It makes sense that someone that Death could narrate a novel set during wartime, because they say war and death are like best friends. And the last thing I'll say about that is, the reason I cut Death out of the book at one point was that he was too sadistic. He was too sardonic. He was enjoying his work too much. And I thought, this just doesn't feel quite right. So I'm always searching. I'm always sort of going, no, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. And then I thought of the last line of the book, and I remember even where I was. I was down in Tasmania on the back step of this little cabin on Coles Bay, and I thought of the last line of the book, and I thought, that's it. Death is actually a little bit afraid of us, and death is afraid for us, and death actually likes us. So I got more of this idea that death was the missing piece of us that makes everything worth it. And I thought, that's how you write the book. And when I went back right to the beginning and I rewrote with that voice on the page, and that's how The Book Thief was kind of written, with, of course, hundreds and hundreds of other little problems that I had to get over along the way.
And it looks like you had a fair bit of fun with death as well. Like he's, you know, as you mentioned, he was going to be this terrible character, and he became this, you know, sort of, you know, he's not a bad guy, and he wants you to know that he's not a bad guy. But that sort of must have been really interesting writing, because a lot of the scenes you would have been having to think, how did death see this?
Yeah, I think it was what allowed me to really get through the book. I mean, the voice of death really carries the book, and no matter what people think of the book, whether they like it or don't like it or whatever, but it was the voice of death that kept me interested and kept me believing in the book. And I find I can't finish a book, I can't finish a story, I can't write through to the end at all unless I'm there, unless I'm really there. I can't go, yeah, I'll just write through this and then fix it. I've got to always feel like I'm there in that scene that I'm writing. And death allowed me to play. And I think that's what I love most about writing, is there's this idea that you go through all these problems and you have all these hurdles, you know, trying to find your original voice. And it's like climbing a mountain, but there's the promise of a sand pit or a sandbox at the top, or a playground where you get to play. And death allowed me to play. And when he or she, in some cases, you know, depending on where the book's published, when I feel like I was at my best was when he would say things like, he would talk to the reader directly and say things like, sometimes I say, God, you know, but God never replies to me. You know, you think you're the only one he doesn't answer. And, or he'd say things like, if you really want to know what I look like, you know, forget the sickle and the, or the scythe and the hood, you know, go and look in the mirror. That's the closest thing. So it was just, death allowed a playfulness to the book that I'm not sure I could have written now. It was just strictly to the naivety of that time that I sort of had the courage to sort of work on that voice. And it just allowed me to play with the form of the page. And it's not a book there's a lot of space in the book, really, where death is sort of pulling the reader aside and saying, look, here are a few facts about this. Yeah. Now I'm going to tell you something that's going to happen later, or something that happened earlier, but I'm not going to tell you everything. So it allowed me to just have a lot of fun with the book. And I know in a way that's kind of appalling. I mean, considering the subject matter, but I always felt like death's heart, and subsequently my heart, was in the right place writing the book. I never doubted that.
Yeah. I'm also interested, and you sort of touched on this at the beginning, about your family stories of World War II and what inspired you in that sense. Can you tell us a little bit about your family's personal connection to the war, and how much of an influence and how much sort of input your parents had in the story that became The Book Thief?
Yeah, that's one it's even difficult to know where to start, because it's almost, they're a little bit like your first memories. And you sort of go, I wonder if that was my first memory, you know, and I wonder if my mum and dad never sat us down and said, right, now we're going to tell you where you're from. A lot of the stories were just about childhood. They weren't about war. They were usually, and I would often say to my dad, for example, I'd say, oh, can you tell me about that kid in your town who, when the carnival came to town, who was up on the, you know, it's like a merry-go-round, but it's up on the chains, you know, and you swing around on that. And I said, remember that there was that guy who the chains came off and he went flying off. And I was like, get my dad to tell me all of these sorts of stories. And there were the two brothers who always imagined that they were riding motorbikes or something, and they started up and jumped over the fence, and then sort of, you know, it's sort of silly stories. And then suddenly, well, not even suddenly, but I realized over time that, my dad was also telling me stories, some that didn't even make it into the book. And sometimes that's the best thing in these situations, is to tell a story that didn't even make it into the book, where my dad was in this sort of gang after World War II, where he was, really young. But they would go around and there were just flares and all sorts of things lying around on the ground, and they would pick them up, and they were boys, so they'd do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with them. But they set off a flare gun once, and it was supposed to go that way, but they bumped it at the last second, and it went straight into the Russian camp, who they were terrified of, because they were occupying their town. And the Russians, they were tough, and so they were really scared of the Russian soldiers. And he said they ran that day because when the flare gun went into the camp, he said, I ran for 3 or 4 kilometers until I couldn't hear the gunfire anymore behind me. And then it led to a day where he was standing on the street. He's just walking down the street, and a Russian truck pulled up on the side of the road, and it was just him and this soldier got out of the truck and walked towards my dad. And he's standing there with his gun by his side, and my dad's this little kid standing on the side of the road. And he said the soldier came up to him and he said, I was just petrified. I was frozen to the spot. And he said the soldier leaned in at him and leaned down, and with his hand, just with the back of his hand, he touched him on the face, and he said, kind, meaning child. And my dad said, and he said he could see the tears in this guy's face, this hardened soldier's face. And then he turned around and he walked back got in the truck, and he drove past. And so what that left me with was sort of questions over the years of, and my dad even said this, he said, what was that man leaving behind in his home, and what had he seen in that war? And that's the sort of story that I would hear, and I'd go, I've got to find a way for that to get into the book. And but it never did make it in. And so I grew up hearing those sorts of stories. I grew up hearing about, kids who would give bread to Jewish prisoners and other so-called criminals on their way, to Dachau outside of Munich, and soldiers would come and rip the bread out of the man. Like, so the classic story was the one where my mum said it was a teenage boy who was one of the most foul-mouthed kids that she'd ever known. It's always reminded me that you never underestimate teenagers, and they're capable of such great things. And this boy ran in because they heard all these people being herded down the street, and there was an old man who couldn't keep up, and he was so emaciated. And this boy ran in, took a piece of bread, and he gave it to him. And this old emaciated man fell to his hands and knees, grabbed the boy by his feet, and cried into his ankles, saying thank you. And a soldier came and ripped the bread away and threw it away. And then he whipped the old man for taking it. And then he chased the boy and whipped him for giving it to him. And it was interesting because when the film then was made, I asked the director why because that scene is in The Book Thief, except it's Hans Huberman who does it. They're always appropriating the true story to fit the world of the book. And so rather than just a teenage boy, I used Hans, and which then had another effect, which was it sort of gives him away as a sympathizer. And so his basement is probably going to be checked and Max has to leave, So, but I remember asking the director why it wasn't in the film, and he said, well, we had historians do all this sort of work and check, and they said, no, a German soldier would never have hit a German citizen. I said, oh, God, you should have just asked me, because Mum saw it with her own eyes.
Yeah.
Of course, soldiers would step out of line of what the rules were, especially when confronted with this act of teenage kindness, So I grew up hearing those stories, and I never thought, I'm going to write a book about those one day. I'm never going to write, that just hit a point where I just went, I want to write about, it just sort of struck me slowly till there was a point when I started writing The Book Thief. And of course, I remind myself of this all the time, even now as I try to write something new again, is you've got to have all these false starts, And I had my first few false starts were Liesl and Hans up on a hill looking down over the town, and I went, there's nothing there. I don't have anything here. There's nothing. And then there was another one which started with a scene that now appears maybe in part 8 or 7 of the book, was where, and it's a true story, where my mum's foster father was so drunk that he woke up, like he was made to sleep outside in the sort of shed, near the apartments where they lived. And it was so cold that he actually couldn't move because he was frozen to the floor. And so my mum's foster mother came and threw a bucket of hot water over him to loosen him from the ice. And I was going to start with that scene, and I went, no, this is not quite right. So I think you spend a lot of time going through the rooms and the corridors of things, and not realizing that you're going to end up finally with a line like, first the colours, then the humans. That's usually how I see things. And I think bringing death into the book really opened up the world of it, and I could kind of go anywhere. There weren't any rules anymore.
Yeah. I want to talk about a couple of the characters and some of them that you've mentioned already, but in terms of some of those incredible stories that you've been sharing, thank you for sharing those with us. There are characters that really sort of encapsulate some of those feelings, and Hans Huberman's one that I think of, and he's stayed with me in the years since I first read the book, as someone who is such an inherently good character, because we, in times of war, which a lot of us can't, even fathom, you like to think, I'd do the right thing if I was in a terrible situation, but there's always so much at stake. And I think that's, some of the things that are really drawn out really beautifully in the book. So, would I hide someone who is Jewish? Would I, be able to, in public, let people know that I don't necessarily believe with everything that, Hitler is doing? And I think you did that really beautifully with Hans Huberman and many characters in the book. Can you tell me a little bit about, did you set out for him to be this great, really good man, or these questions that you were thinking yourself? What would I do if I was in these situations where my family might be at risk, or
Yeah, that's such a hard one, because none of us can actually know.
No.
And and it's interesting, I was talking to my dad the other day, and and typically, just talking about the current situation, and he's like, oh, this is easy.
Yeah.
Oh, we had bombs, he's like, we had bombs coming down, and we had this happening, and not to mention, he said, no, I was one of the lucky ones. I could have been one of those people on their way to a camp, and so on. And so I think with Hans Huberman, what I did is I took two real people and and mashed them together. I took my mum's foster father and my dad's father. And there's a really, a couple of points about him that are kind of worth recognizing. And the first is there were times where I had to toughen him up a bit and make him not so nice. Like there's a moment where he slaps Liesl to sort of bring home, it's when she says, I hate Hitler, to him after the book burning, and he slaps her really hard. And I could have made that, originally it was a much more gentle moment, but I wanted to make him real. I wanted to make him more human, that even though he's doing it for a good reason, he has the capability to really sting her, and sure, he does drink, a little bit. He at one point he drank a lot more in the book, because that was the real character of my mum's father a bit more. But there was a really interesting moment later on, and this was based on a true story, where Hans is sent to the Second World War after having been already in the First World War, which is what happened to my dad's father. And that was because him and his wife wouldn't let my dad go to this special Nazi school. And so they went, right, we can't take your son, we're taking you, and you can do the worst job, which is to dismantle landmines and put buildings out that are on fire. And those stories would be, there'd be one person putting the fire out, and there'd be another guy hosing the guy who was putting the fire out to make sure he didn't catch fire. And so, but there was a moment that, and it's a true story, where my grandfather, whom I never met, was in this truck, and all these soldiers are driving along this mountainside, and they got out and did some work. And as they got back in, he sat in this spot, and this other guy says to him, "Hey, that's my spot." And my dad's father, who was much tougher, he was not a Hans Huberman character, he said, "Well, not anymore. He's going to have to sit somewhere else." And originally in the book, that's exactly what Hans did. He said, "Yeah, no, that's not your spot anymore. Move on," you know. And I just kept it and kept it and kept it until finally I just went, "No, not Hans Huberman would never have done that. He would have said, oh, of course, you know, I'll go and sit over there." Now, what happened in the real life story was that the truck got a busted tire and turned over, and that guy died in the accident, and my dad's father survived. And then the same thing happens in the book, but Hans Huberman survives because of his kindness. And so it's the sort of character, and you're always just building and building and building. And I realized early on that I wanted to give all the characters certain traits. Like I gave Hans silver eyes, but they're only silver to the people who recognize their value. To everyone else, they're just sort of grey, tin colored eyes. But, you know, to people who really see him, you know, there's a silver glint in those eyes. You know, much as the same way that Rosa, you know, has elastic strands of hair, and Alex Steiner is a really wooden character. Everything's wood with him, splinters of hair, you know, and Max is bird-like, you know, so Max has feathers of hair and that turn into twigs, like a nest of hair when when it hasn't been washed. And these all had meanings, you know, I guess, in the case of Max, the feathers he was like I wanted him to be a bird in captivity in his own country. So I gave him those traits, you know, which was then illustrated so perfectly by Trudy White, you know, who did the illustrations when Max does the picture book, makes the picture book for Liesl. And she said to me, this is one of my favorite facts about the book is she said, or anecdotes about the book, is when she came to do the illustrations, there were two things. I wanted, because the story is written over the top of painted pages of Mein Kampf, where Max is painted over them, I wanted the words of Mein Kampf to bleed through. And so I know I'm going on a tangent now. And I didn't tell Trudy that, but she did it. She let the words of Mein Kampf bleed through. So you can see those words of destruction underneath, you know, this story of friendship. You know, so you've got the history of things and of this sort of regime with the personal story of friendship over the top, sort of slowly bleeding that out. And but the other thing she said to me was, "Can I draw Max as a bird?" And originally I was a bit skeptical. I went, "Oh, I don't know." And then I said, "Just go ahead and do it, and then we'll take a look." And then I saw it, and I just went, you know, it's amazing. It's beautiful and it's perfect. I've just got a shot of it here. Like, so it starts off there. You can see that's not Max, but my favorite one was always this one. And the one on the door, so let's see, where she drew the door of 33 Himmel Street, but she didn't draw the house. She just drew the door and left it just left the rest to the reader. And but the best part was later on when I said, "God, the bird thing worked so well. You know, it's so great." And she said, "Yeah, there was another reason for that, and that is that," and she won't mind me saying this, she said, "I'm just better at drawing animals than I am at drawing people." And so it's all these little happy accidents that lead to a book becoming the personality that it is. So you know, I'm really grateful to her and to everyone else who was involved with the book, you know, right down from my parents to then other people I spoke to, you know, the Sydney Jewish Museum, you know, it's just amazing. And so I just had a lot of luck with this book, you know, I kept tripping over these little pieces of luck, and Hans Huberman and Max, and, you know, they're characters who've stayed with me and, you know, for the rest of my life as well.
Excellent. And of course, as book lovers, you know, you mentioned the the writing and the drawing over Mein Kampf. There's a, for all our book lovers out there, there's a definite feel of not just stealing books, but Liesl learning how to read and the value that she places on books when she finds the, grave digger's handbook, and she doesn't even know how to read it, but it's so special to her. And, there's, she goes and visits the mayor's wife and is just in awe with her book collection, and all these kind of really significant looks at reading and books and literature. Did you have a lot of fun sort of weaving that through the book, and is that sort of indicative of your love of reading and what you wanted to write about?
Yeah, I mean, books have given me everything, and I still, it's funny, even just last week, we decided, since we're all in sort of at least semi-lockdown, down here in Australia, it's it's been a good opportunity to reconnect with certain things that we did before. And so I just recently read The Outsiders to after lunch every day, to my wife and two kids who are 14 and 10, and I know 10's a bit young for that book, but and that was one of the books that just brought me to life as not only a reader but a writer, and as a person, and made me realize what books meant to me, because I wanted to be those boys in that book. And and it's such a remarkable achievement of S.C. Hinton's, even though later on in life I sort of look at Rumblefish as her real masterpiece, but opinions vary on that as well. But all of those sorts of things, I remember there's that moment where Liesl is in the mayor's wife's library. You're very kind to me, by the way, Kate, because you're filling in the plot that I didn't give everyone at the start. But when she's standing there, and I think the line is that just this acreage of books before her, and just that sense of wonder. I didn't have exactly the same sense over the Easter weekend when I reorganised all my books. Oh my God, how can I end up less at the end of even getting rid of the books that I had doubles of, and but I think, to me, just this idea that books sort of sum up the idea for us that what we're really made of is our stories. Stories are what make us who we are, and are what make us question ourselves and our decisions, and and also they entertain us. And I think it's my favourite form of entertainment when those sparks become a fire, and when you're sitting there. And I remember just turning pages in the night with my brother lying across from me in the bedroom that we shared, but there was no way I was turning the light off. I was going to read this one chapter and then the next chapter, and I embedded all of that into The Book Thief. And I didn't originally, when I thought just put a girl stealing books into this idea set in Nazi Germany, I didn't even think about how books were burnt and how there were book burnings in Nazi Germany. It just felt right. And and that's what I would say to anyone out there who is watching, who's currently wanting to write, or is that you're just looking for what feels right a lot of the time, and no matter how many times you go, oh, that's no good, that's the test, is turning up again and turning up again. I quit The Book Thief so many times, and I remember writing, cutting it apart and just going, oh, I'm only going to write this part, but somehow I just sort of kept turning up for it, and it sort of became this book that's, I always think of it as just this magical sort of book. It's a book that it's had and when I say magical, I don't mean because of anything I did with it. It's just had a magical life. It's a lucky book,
Yeah.
And every time you think it's going to go away, it sort of comes back, and then even like with the Dymocks 101 and all of that, or a play gets made, or something, or and then just when we thought there'll never be the films, you never think a film's going to be made anyway, and then these things, it's just had a crazy, magically lucky life.
I'm interested in sort of in terms of, you know, the book has had its own life. It's sold 16 million copies. It's been a huge success. Where has the book taken you physically in terms of touring, and what sort of parts of the world has it taken you to? Have you ever done a book event in Germany? I think is a very interesting one as well. And also, where's it taken you emotionally? Because
it's been a doorway or a gateway to the world, this book. And so I have been to Germany, and I'll come back to that in a second. But everywhere from, even places I've been in the last couple of years, I know I'm there, because of the book thief as much as anything, more than anything. And so I've been everywhere from, Norway to Brazil, New Zealand, China, Taiwan, and all through Europe, and America and the UK, and it's just insane, really. And and the story I always love the most is, and it's funny because everyone, when I tell it, they kind of laugh because they think that there's a sinister idea in this, and it's not sinister at all. But when I got to Brazil. And this is back in 2007, and that was such a great story because, I had a choice to go with a really huge, reputable, much-loved publisher in Brazil, or a guy called George who had this publishing house called Intrinsica that was just starting, and he just seemed so keen, and I just kind of went, I got a really great feeling about this guy. And so I went with him for less money and all that stuff. And then I got an email from him on Good Friday in 2007 saying, guess what? The Book Thief is #2 on the bestseller list in Brazil. And 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini was #1. And then a month passed. I didn't think too much about it. And then I got another email from George, and it says, guess what? And I'm not sure what how rated this is, so I'll curb it a little bit. But he said, guess what? Finally got rid of the effing Kite Runner, But the beauty of it was the next week, 1,000 Splendid Suns came out and went straight to #1. But I got to visit Brazil then, and it was this sort of crazy day. I landed at 2 a.m. My publisher, George, picked me up at the airport, which is almost unheard of, that your publisher himself or herself will come and pick you up at the airport. And then he drove me through the city, and didn't stop at any red lights and because you can't really. And then he took me to have something to eat. And this is at 2 a.m, and at 9 o'clock the next morning, I got picked up to go to a sort of a boys' home, and it was with the First Lady of Rio, who traveled by helicopter around the city. So I had to go up in this helicopter, and then it was amazing, and at the end of it all, we dropped her off after visiting these boys at this school, and then the pilot said, we're going to go up now. We've got some time, so we're going to fly around the Christ the Redeemer statue. And wow. It's such an iconic thing in Rio, and there was not a cloud in the sky. And I remember we flew around that monument, and I just thought, this is incredible. And I just, and I couldn't, and I always meant this in the most innocent kind of loving way, but I thought, I bet this has never happened to Tim Winton or Peter Carey. And in a way, I was just like, how lucky am I? Like, it's me. It's like, I'm just this kid really from the suburbs of Sydney, and this is happening right now. And so it was more a moment of appreciate it, and which led to sort of then in 2008, I remember going to Germany, and I was really nervous about that because, and more in the sense of not so much what the book was about or what it did or any, it was more just having my research right. I didn't want to go to Germany and they say, well, you got this wrong and you got this wrong and you got this wrong. And, and I'd researched really hard, but you can't, it doesn't matter how meticulously you research, you're always going to miss something, or even more so, the more meticulously you research, you'll miss something. But that was an amazing experience, actually. And I remember being in Leipzig in a kind of, these sort of old German taverns, all wood and everything, and this really nice crowd in there. And I was speaking German, sort of half German, half English, but mostly German. And yeah, it felt like the book had sort of come home, and that was a really beautiful experience. And as for emotionally, it was the first time I'd finished a book where I realized, I think I'd published 4 books before that really meant a huge amount to me, but I realized this book meant everything. And it took me a while to recover. It took me a long time to start writing Bridge of Clay, and then and all the false starts I had with that. But but since then it's just sort of stayed with me, and it's been the book that just wouldn't go away. So I've never had a chance, even talking about it now, I realize how much I remember of the book, because it just hasn't had a chance to disappear on me. And like I said, that's why I'm so grateful to it.
Amazing. I want to open up to some audience questions soon, so make sure that you post a whole bunch of questions, because I'm sure you've got a lot to ask Markus. He's definitely giving us lots to think about. But I'm interested, let's just chat for a minute about Bridge of Clay, because I absolutely loved Bridge of Clay, and the Dunbar brothers as a wonderful Australian novel. I'm interested, in sort of how you came up with the idea of these 4 brothers, and the story of the mother and their missing father who went missing, and the pack of animals. And it's sort of, we could talk about that book all night as well, but I'm just interested in what the inspiration was for Bridge of Clay, and then we'll get chatting to some audience questions after that.
Yeah, I think the first thing, Bridge of Clay, thank you for being so generous about it. It's one of those right, it's one of those, the first hurdle Bridge of Clay ever had was that I'd always thought it was my best idea, and I'd actually written one version of it. And this again comes back to my earlier point about that you're always looking for what's right, what feels right. So I'd written a version of Bridge of Clay probably in my early 20s or mid 20s, and so it just didn't work. And so I thought, okay, put that aside for now. And so and then the Book Thief came along. I think I wrote The Messenger in the meantime. Then I wrote The Book Thief, and The Book Thief just sort of swept. It was like a tidal wave that just swept Bridge of Clay away, and everything else for that matter that I'd written. And so I kind of had to climb up out of that water to start writing that book. And I knew the original one was no good. It was pretty small, and I wanted to write another book that meant everything to me. And I can't remember exactly when it was that I thought, well, there was a time where I thought, right, he's going to have 3 brothers. And then I went, no, he's going to be one of 3 brothers. I thought, no, he's one of 5 brothers. They were always going to have these pets. They were going to have a cat. And I had this image. There was an important image of the cat at the end of the book. And I went, no, not a cat. I've got a mule. And so bit by bit, it started getting crazier.
Obviously.
And crazier. So, yeah, it's one of those books that it was a huge undertaking and took a lot. I'm still a bit, every now and again, I realize how beaten up I am. I mean, don't worry about the emotional toll the Book Thief took on me. It was Bridge of Clay that really beat me up. I mean, we're talking about 13 years of work, and the amount of times, and I probably sank to some of my lowest lows writing that book. And when I say that's sort of almost, you think of me sort of going on drunken binges and whatever, but no, I just felt really, I just wasn't alive inside as a writer anymore because of how much that book had beaten me up, because I just couldn't get it right. And but I love that book for that reason now, because I persisted with that character and those boys. And I think one of the reasons that it was so difficult was that I knew, like, where the voice carries the Book Thief, the voice of Matthew was always going to be a more serious voice. He'd seen too much and worked, kind of so hard that he's not a captivating voice the way Death is. And so I had to be true. You've always got to be true to the book, be true to the characters in the book. And so that's why I think it took a while to persist with and to be courageous, to be brave, with those sorts of decisions. And I mean, even there, originally, the first 6 years, the book did have a different narrator, but out of the ashes of that might be your next book. So it's all of these things that don't make it into the book that prop the actual finished product up. Just for a moment now, I just saw a question come up saying, how did your parents react?
Yeah, that's it. And we sort of touched on this yesterday. You said, oh, yes, the parents.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I mean, I used to, and then there's a thing about the musical adaptation, which we can talk about. But, my parents are really funny. And while I was writing The Book Thief, and I interviewed them even after all their story, knowing all their stories. But then they had this real stake in the book then, and they kept some, my dad especially was, this is not real, obviously not an actual word, but he was unput up with him. You just couldn't put up with him. And he was, to use, let me think, Eliza Bennett, he was insufferable in the writing of that book, saying, when's it going to be finished? And I'd say, I've got all these problems. I've got the bombs coming down and I've got to get the years right. I've got to get the places right. And my dad would just look at me and go, just make it up. I mean, you're a writer, and I'd say, yeah, but you got to have integrity, but it was really funny at the end. I gave them the manuscript for Christmas before 9 months before the book came out. And I rang then on New Year's Day and talked to my dad. And I asked him where he was up to in the reading of the book. And he said, yeah, it's going pretty well. I'm up to page 9. And then he said, but, you got to let me explain. He said, your mum's reading, she's always reading it. So she was up to page 300 and something. And so when he did finally finish it, he swore at me and he said, you made me cry. And, and that was really nice. But there are all these sorts of stories. It's mainly, my mum's, they're just really, they're really proud of the book. And I think they're proud of their part in it. And, and my mum rereads it every now and again, and she listens to the audio when she drives somewhere, and that's really nice. My dad's still funny though. This is the last story I'll say about that. I'll tell about that is he says things like, when it came out in German, he read the German book and the English book version side by side. And he said afterwards, now, it's not exactly that the book is shit in English. It's just that it's so much better in German. And I said, yeah, that's great, Dad. Thanks. The German translator is a much better writer than I am. But he says that every time, no matter which book, he says, the German translation's so great. I think he's in love with the translator. And so their reactions have been, really, I think great, especially, they consider themselves lucky, part of lucky characters in history, and then that they came to Australia and made new lives and couldn't speak English here and gave all us kids a lot of books. And because they saw that was the key to getting somewhere, and that one of their kids ended up being a writer is kind of perfect in a way.
Totally. Well, not that it's shit in English or anything, but I hear the musical that's being by Jodie Picoult, no less. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's why I say that the Book Thief is just a lucky book, and things come along, and every now and again, something will come up, and I'll say, I don't know, that doesn't feel quite right, or I'm not sure. And then in this case, I'd met Jodie just in doing just a few events in America, a few, once or twice, and I just thought she was being nice about the book, when she said, this book's, something special, and she was so generous, and then she said, how would you feel about a musical? And I said, oh, well, I don't know. They made the film and they own all the rights. She said, don't worry about all that. I mean, she's one of those people where, and I don't think she'll mind me saying this either, is, I mean, I'm constantly in awe of her ability to do at least 1,000 things at exactly 1,000 miles an hour. It's sort of like if someone sends me an email, they get a reply a fortnight later. You send her an email after you've been, waiting a while, and you get a reply 14 seconds later. She just gets things done, and so she said, "Oh, we'll sort all that out. Just let me know who to talk to and whatever." And then a week later or 2 weeks later, she said, "Yeah, well, we're gonna do it." And then she already had writers. I've already heard some of the songs, and they're really great. And I've met, her writing partner and the songwriters, and so I was sitting there because there was a different musical Between the Lines that she had written with her daughter. That was was having its opening. There's always an out of town opening, and it was in Kansas City. And I met the team of writers and songwriters and everything there, and they were just really nice people. And in the end, that's kind of what draws me to sort of say yes. So you sort of just get a feeling about the person, and these people were great. The material was great, and they've been really respectful. So as I always say, in the end, we'll just see what happens. But I'm excited, and I'm not as worried because I didn't write it. Pressure's on them.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions coming through about sort of your writing in the COVID situation, but we've got one here from Steve Cox, which is, do your kids help the writing process or hinder? I guess everyone's sort of, in their houses, stuck in their houses at the moment. We've got kids crawling all over us. How are your kids playing into the way that you're writing at the moment? Or are you getting it done?
Let me first say it's an honour above all honours to get a message from you, Steve, and let me just say I have got nothing done in the last couple of weeks. But what I find mostly is that when you're not writing well, when you're cutting corners, when you're doing the wrong things, and you're not being disciplined, that's when you blame everybody around you. Every time I've finished a book, someone has been renovating next door, or I've been renovating, or a house is being built and there's noise everywhere. And what I find is that's your true test of how you're working, because it never bothered me when I was doing all the right things. And so I think I'm hitting the point now where I've had quite a few false starts in what I'm sort of looking at writing now. And then you get to a point where you say, right, false start, and now it's time to really get serious and to commit. And every now and again I want to write, just on one piece of paper, that commitment is the key to everything. And I even think, even in just little ways, I mean, think of maybe sports you do or things like that. It's sort of, I remember thinking sometimes, like say you're trying to surf, the one thing everyone tells you is when you go you've just got to commit. You've got to commit. And that's the point I'm at now where, so my kids, they do give me a bit of material every now and again. So I'm like, let me just think, even recently, but it's more my reactions. And I shouldn't even be saying this, but, there was one the other day where I said, I just made lunch, and I called out to my son. I said, right, lunch is ready. And he's called back, I'm not hungry. And I'm not going to say exactly what my response was, but the translation into more polite English was, I really don't care that you're not hungry. Just get down, just get in here. So it's more just little bits of dialogue, I find. And it, since we've all sort of been on our best behavior and keeping ourselves at home, I think on the first day, I told my son, like I did the typical, and all of you Australian, people watching there, you'll notice the accent of this, of just like, sit down. I already said, like, sit down, like, really harshly once. The next day it was, shut up. And then and I was just waiting for them. I said to my wife, like, tomorrow I'm going to just tell him to get out. But the problem is there's nowhere to go. And so I think all these little bits and pieces, whilst, you know, you just collect them and then you find what's usable. And so, yeah, I'll often find just a couple of little ones here and there that I can use. And so, you know, a couple of them ended up in The Book Thief, you know, well, obviously from my parents, and a couple of little ones ended up in Bridge of Clay, you know, from my kids as well.
Yeah, I've got a few more questions here. The Book Thief is everyone's favorite book. What's the best book you've read recently?
Well, this is always one of those ones where you go afterwards, you go, oh, damn it, you know, I forgot this book or this book. I've been reading a lot of short stories lately, and one I've been going through for months now is the complete short stories of Kurt Vonnegut. And if anyone, I mean, and because we're, you know, they're just amazing. And the thing that I realize I've overused that word tonight. I'm going to get in trouble for that later. It's incredible, because when you think of Kurt Vonnegut, we always think of just that wild imagination and the chattiness of it. But what I realized reading these stories is just, you know, how warm. He was a really warm writer. And I think that's what I love most about him. So that's one. I've also been reading Night Train, which is short stories again by Tom Jones, Tom with an H, like Tom York. And I've only read the first few of those, but what I find is that I'll reread the stories a couple of times. So that idea of reading widely is true, but I also think you've got to read narrowly as well. So there too. Another one was Pat Barker's book, The Silence of the Girls, which really blew me away. You know, a sort of retelling of the Iliad through Briseis, you know, and the way she saw things. And yeah, that's well worth a visit as well. So there are three for the moment.
Yeah, excellent. And I've got Danielle's got the question here. What advice would you give young writers who maybe aren't as confident in regards to creative writing?
Well, so this is Danielle. I can say to you, Danielle, that I was never confident, and I am still not confident as a writer. I'm always in deep water. I'm always over my head. I always feel like there are better writers out there than me, and there are. But that doesn't mean I should stop. And in a way, that's what keeps me going. I remember sitting in high school classes where I never got good results for creative writing ever. I got good results for essays, which I actually think is better training for writing novels anyway, because you're paying very close attention to structure and getting everything in the right order and getting everything right, and that's what you do in a novel. So what my advice is to not worry. What you're trying to do is write so much like yourself so that no one else could have written it. That's your criteria. That's what I'm always trying to do, because I know there are better writers. There are smarter writers. There are more literary writers and funnier writers, but I'm the only writer who can write like me. And I know that with a book like The Book Thief or Bridge of Clay, is that I know there are better books out there, but but nobody else could have written those books, and that's what makes them what they are. So always just remember that, and also remember that someone like me who's had, you know, I can't even say so-called, who's had a sort of measure of success, is that I doubt myself all the time, and I don't think it would be worth it if we didn't. And the last thing I'll say about that is all of my favorite writers that I know feel exactly the same way. You know, and the writer I don't trust is the one who says, I've just finished my new book, it's even better than my last one. You know, there aren't many of them, believe me. But most of my favorite writers say, oh God, you should see this piece of, you know, garbage that I've finished. And I say, I'm sure it's brilliant. So don't worry about doubting yourself. It's all part of it, and it's what makes it worth it.
I only just realized that we've been talking for almost an hour. How did that time go so fast?
It's you know, I don't, you know, I could sort of talk all night, and especially when it comes to being with readers as well. You know, it's one of the best things. I mean, I spend so much time on my own, and it is hard to get me out of the house. I'm not going to lie about that. But then when I am, you know, at a Dymocks event or anything like that, you really come to life because you realise you're talking about what you love with people who love that same thing. So no, I'm not worried about the time at all.
Well, I think Sarah there has a really great question probably for us to end on anyway, which is, you mentioned that you're not doing all that much writing in COVID times, but is there a sort of novel that you're working on? Is there a story that you're working on? Something that you can give us an insight into as your next project?
Yeah, of course. Before I answer that one, a question did come up, which I thought was a pretty funny question that just popped up on screen for a second, which was, how can I meet your parents? And my answer to that is, you'll regret it. You'll regret it after my dad's been talking to you forever. But it's sort of that. In that case, I'd sort of say you kind of already know my parents, and you'll have these sorts of people in your life who will always tell you a great story. And so what I would say is look for those people in your life because you've got them. And because my mum can entertain you with the most banal story, and so that they just find those people who can entertain you all the time. That's my mum and dad. So I am writing a new book, and I'm trying to, and it's not that I don't want to give it away, but I was originally thinking it's going to be, just a normal kind of novel length. Then I was toying again with the idea of it being a novella, something shorter, and
safe though, and look what happened.
Yeah, I always had the idea because there was a girl called Maggie who was writing a story, who was narrating Bridge of Clay, and then I realised when I cut her out of the book completely that she may have her own novel, and she is the central character of the new novel. I'm going through all sorts of different titles at the moment. Originally, the title I was thinking of at the moment, I always give too much away. but the title I was going to use was The Second Spaniard, and there is a definite reason for the title, and it does actually have something to do with Bridge of Clay. I always felt like there was a companion book to that novel. I'll never write. They say never say never, but I'll never write a sequel or a companion book to The Book Thief, I don't think. It just doesn't feel right. But Bridge of Clay, because it has the Iliad and the Odyssey running through it, always felt like there was another book there. And a lot of it, because it has so many characters, it felt like there was more room for some of those other characters to have their own novel. And in this case, I did think that what if, on the off chance, Ted and Catherine Novak did have another daughter and named her Maggie, and I thought I could write her story. And I've written about 30 pages that I'm not happy with, and that's where I am at the moment. But and I've tried all sorts of different first lines, and I can't remember the one I'm up to at the moment, which is unusual. Usually I've gone over it a hundred. So you can see I'm still grasping around to find the right, raft to hang on to. But so that's where I am. And some people say, oh, well, looking forward to that one coming out in 13 years, but I don't want it to take that long, definitely.
Some people are buying it already. Some of these comments, everyone's like, I'm on it.
It's a good chance now just to say to all of you who've come, I know, that you could be streaming something right now. You could be watching, let me think, you could be watching The Big Lebowski right now for the 17th time, but you're tuned into this. So thank you so much, all of you, not only for reading my books, but for reading everybody's and for participating in this. And while I'm at it, thanks to all you guys at Dymocks, even you, Steve Cox. Thank you for doing this, because it's, and from the ones I've seen, it's it's been great, and it's made this period, all the more bearable. It's made it really, really fun.
Thank you so much, Markus. And I mean, you are here because so many of our book lovers just absolutely love The Book Thief and Bridge of Clay. So I want to say thank you so much for giving us so many of these beautiful stories tonight. It really given a lot of depth even to a story that is already something that's so heartfelt and so amazing and timeless as well. 15 years later and people are still saying it's their favorite book. So here's the books here. And we have a bit of a 3 for 2 competition on the 101 at the moment. And both of these books are in it. So if you buy both of these, you can get a free book. But I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Markus Zusak, for joining us this evening. I'm sure you can the applause. And thanks to Pam McMillan as well. And thanks heaps to our tech support, Tim, who's doing a great job. If you enjoyed the chat this evening on Chapter 1, we do have the wonderful Dervla McTiernan, who's going to be speaking on Friday night at 8 p.m. The Good Turn. That's like my favourite crime novel this year. And enough of the spiel for me. I just want to say a massive thank you, Markus. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for giving us the time and your incredible stories this evening.
Oh, Kate, thank you. Thanks for making it so easy. And thanks to all of you readers as well. It's been beautiful. Thanks.
Thanks to everyone who's watched in. Till next time.